Hello, we're going to cover putting on lath and scratch coat for manufactured stone. First, let's talk a little bit about the wall and preparation. The wall, in this case, is a framed building. It could be steel studs, wood frame, doesn't matter. It's a framed building with sheathing, and it has building wrap of some kind over top of the framing. Now, that's going to be owed to us from the framer, the general, whoever. However, the Manufactured Stone Institute requires 2 layers of air and water barrier on this application anytime you're putting up lath. So we would then own, in part of our scope, the second layer, which is tar paper. Typically, we're going to put this up with a hammer tacker, a stapler, just a real quick boom, boom, boom. You only need to hold it in place because as soon as you put the lath on, that's going to really attach it to the building. The lath gets nails. Now hopefully we're going over plywood. We can put a nail every 6 to 12 inches horizontally and vertically. If we're not, which is rare, but if we're not, then we have to make sure we're hitting studs. And if it's steel studs, then we're going to have to use screws. The preference in this application is to go over a plywood sheathing and use a nailer, a nail gun, small compressor with a roofing nails in a gun, and quickly put them on. One thing to remember is you have to lap your seams. So your seams have to be lapped at least a couple inches. Now that makes things tricky to keep your wall flat and smooth. Not a big deal when you're laying stone. It's a problem when you're doing thin brick. Typically, guys will cheat and not lap it on the thin brick. What we typically do is we use a tab system instead of a lath and a scratch coat whenever we're using thin brick. This is predominantly used for manufactured stone. Now that we have the lath up, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to apply the scratch coat. So we got to apply mortar over top all the wire. The best way to do that is put the mortar board right on the ground or right on the scaffold. If you're elevated in the air on scaffold, there's going to be a gap here. Just put your foot on the back of the board so that as you're pushing mortar to the front, you're not tipping your board into the gap. The other thing to remember, especially at the ground, is you got weep screed at the bottom. You don't want to plug the weep screed up. So if you're on the ground, you put something under your board at the front to get it up above the weep screed. Sometimes you can simply just rest it on the weep screed. Then what we want to do is do an upward motion. And you're gathering the material into the trowel, and you're holding the trowel at the proper angle so the bottom of the blade is off the lath just enough to leave the material behind as you spread it. Transfer that material up here, then change my angle to deposit the material on the wall. You're going to want to go thinner right where your seams are. You want to be thinner at the seams, at your lap, and thicker where you're not at lap. One thing that you want to have when you're doing this is a hawk board. This is a hawk board. You can make it out of a piece of plywood, scrap piece of wood. You should have a couple mortar boards handy on the scaffold with material on them. When you're going around an electric box or a window, this technique doesn't always work. So you'll want to it's a good way to come under your sills. And like I was saying, perhaps there's an electric box that you have to work around. That's when the hawk comes in handy. So as you can see, when I moved the board, I was able to keep the weep screed relatively free the holes are open so any moisture can get through. Just scrape it back and then spread the excess where you had started. Now we're going to scratch it. This is why we call it the scratch coat. This tool is designed specifically for this application. And what you want to do is just take horizontal lines straight across. Not everyone has one of these. Some guys don't do this work very often. You could also use a notch trowel that you might have for setting ceramic tile. This is not as ideal. It removes a little bit too much material, but it will work. The idea is that you're creating a rough surface to grab with the mortar that you're putting on the back of the stone. And you like the horizontal because it keeps your mortar from sliding when you lock into it. It creates a lock that it is resisting the horizontal sag. If you do vertical lines, then when you put your stone on with the mortar, it may have a tendency to sag a little bit. So horizontal scratches.